Hey Optimancers! So it is time for our third level wizard guide, and we're going to begin with our usual recap. I will be listing the spells for third level for wizard. I'm going to be listing a reference so that you can find them in your player's handbook or Xanathar's guide, and I'm going to be rating them. And the ratings are going to be red if it's not a good spell, or I don't think it does what it should do. Then I will rate it orange if I think it is a spell that could be good in the right circumstance, but it's too circumstantial. And then I will rate it purple if I think it's an okay spell or decent spell for you to take. I will rate it green if I think it's a good spell and I'm recommending it. And I will rate it blue if I think it's kind of a must-have spell, a great spell. And next week, we'll be talking about our fourth level spells, and I'm being asked a couple times now about doing wizard builds. And if you look at my initial Treantmonk's Guide to Wizards introduction video, I list the order in which the videos will appear. And after we're done going over the mechanics of the wizards, I am going to be doing a build video for every subclass of wizards. So there are lots and lots of wizard builds coming. And for third level spells, this is when things get really amazing for wizards, because we all know that when you get to third level spells, that's when the spells become really powerful. So, let's get started. So, as always, I will be listing the wizard school, and I'm going to rank the spells in order from my most to least favorite for each school. So we will start out with our Abjuration school, and my favorite spell of the Abjuration school, this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, it's Counterspell. Counterspell is a spell that really separates our wizards and our sorcerers from, say, our clerics and our druids, because now if there was ever a spell duel between them, the wizard can simply shut down the cleric or the druid using Counterspell. So Counterspell uses your reaction, and when you see somebody else casting a spell, you cast Counterspell, and it can prevent them from casting the spell. Now, if the spell is third level or lower, it automatically works. So somebody's going to cast a fireball at you, and you Counterspell it, that's it, it's done. Now, technically speaking, a Counterspell can be counterspelled. So another caster could counter your Counterspell, and things can become complex that way, but everyone only has one reaction per turn, so there is going to be an end result at some point. Now, if the spell is fourth level or higher that you're counterspelling, then either you have to cast Counterspell at the higher spell level to automatically dispel it, or you're going to have to make an ability check based on the level of spell that you're defeating. Now, at 10th level, an Abjurer is going to get a bonus to that check, and that bonus is going to be equal to your proficiency bonus. Speaking of Abjurers, we should note that, of course, all these spells, as well as being effective, are also restoring your Arcane Ward. But at 5th level, no one's getting a bonus. The only way to really assure of it working is maybe if you are a Diviner and you're willing to use one of your Portents, one of your higher rolls, to ensure your Counterspell works. Now, there are other ways to boost ability checks, but again, you don't necessarily know when you're going to be casting Counterspell. So I wouldn't worry too much about boosting your ability check. So most of the time when you use this at 5th level or 6th level, you're going to be counterspelling spells that are 3rd level or lower. And then the spells that are higher level, you will always have the option to use a higher level spell slot if you're higher level. If not, you'll be making an ability check. It's not all that hard to make. It's a DC of 10 plus the spell level, and then you get an intelligence check to make that roll. So if you have an intelligence of, say, 18, you got like a +4 on that roll already. So even if you, say, roll an 11, you can counterspell a 5th level spell. But there is definitely a chance of failure. And speaking of making ability checks to dispel spells, my next favorite Abjuration spell at this level is Dispel Magic. So Dispel Magic is an action to cast, and it's something you're going to cast on your turn. So you're not using it to cancel out things like a fireball. But if an enemy maybe has some buffs on themselves or debuffs on you or your allies, that's a perfect time to use a Dispel Magic, because then it can remove that effect. One nice thing about Dispel Magic over, say, something like Counterspell is you can remove more than one magical effect. So if, say, an enemy has multiple buffs on them, you could remove all those buffs with one Dispel Magic spell. Like with Counterspell, if you are dispelling a spell of 4th level or higher, you'll be making an ability check. It's exactly the same. And also, again, if you're an Abjurer and you're 10th level or higher, you will get a bonus on that check. My next favorite Abjuration spell at this level is Nondetection. Now, Nondetection is cast on either a creature, an object, or a location, and then it is protected from all divination magic for 8 hours with no concentration from you. Now, this is still a fairly circumstantial ability, but because it doesn't use concentration and has a great duration, it's a good spell for a buff, especially if you're a higher level caster and you can afford those 3rd level spell slots. Now, it only protects you from divination magic, so there are other ways to detect invisible, things like blind sense, and those will still work. Still, because it doesn't use concentration, because it lasts a long time, I think it's an okay spell to take as a buff. And this is a spell that is going to scale well. It's going to continue as you move up in levels as a decent spell to take. My next favorite Abjuration spell at this level is Glyph of Warding. Now, Glyph of Warding, most traditionally, we find it as a trap against players. So you find a spell book and you open it up and it explodes and people take damage. Another thing Glyph of Warding can do, though, is deliver a spell. And one of the things that can be done is you can use Glyph of Warding as a buff for yourself. So you cast a Glyph of Warding with a buff spell on it, and then you activate the Glyph of Warding, and then that buff spell is cast on you. And most importantly, you don't have to concentrate on it. Now, Glyphs of Warding cannot be moved far from their original location, or they go off. So this isn't something that you can do before an adventure and then take the glyphs with you. But what you could do at high levels is do something like, say, a demi-plane, and then you could have a Glyph of Warding in a demi-plane, and then you could access it through that, touch a bunch of Glyphs of Warding, get a bunch of buffs up, and then come out, and then you're all buffed up. Still, this costs 100 gold pieces to do, and I think the uses of it are very limited. At high levels, there's ways to exploit it, but for its intended purpose, I think it's a very circumstantial spell. My next favorite spell for this level is Protection from Energy. Now, Protection from Energy, I think, is basically a worse spell than Absorb Elements because it requires your action to cast, so you need to know beforehand what you're going to be facing. You have to pick the energy type when you cast it. And most importantly, it requires your concentration. And because it only requires resistance, there's only 2 things that can happen. Either one, you're not targeted with that energy type, in which case you didn't need to cast this spell at all. Or you are targeted with this energy type and you will take damage from that energy type, which means that anytime this spell is useful, you will automatically have to make a concentration save. So that is a risk I don't particularly like, and the concentration then conflicts with other concentration spells. So when we're talking about protecting ourselves from energy, I far prefer just taking Absorb Elements and relying on that. Though there's limitations there too. I mean, it's using your reaction. It's only lasting for 1 round. But still, I think it is a superior form of protection. Now, we could have protection from energy and still use Absorb Elements to protect ourselves from other kinds of energy we might be facing if we're expecting to be facing multiple kinds of energy damage. There are certain circumstances where protection from energy is going to be useful. You know what you're facing. You're going to be facing a red dragon. The fighter needs some kind of protection. You can cast protection from energy on the fighter, and then if the fighter takes the damage from the energy and you can avoid that energy damage, then in that case, you don't have to make a concentration save. But as a self-buff, I think it has some problems. I will say, though, the 1 hour duration is pretty good. My next favorite Abjuration spell at this level is Remove Curse, and Remove Curse is obviously going to be a circumstantial spell because it's only useful if you or one of your party members gets cursed. So it'll remove the curse from a party member or yourself, or if a party member has come in contact with a cursed item, you can use it to remove the connection between the PC and the cursed item, though it doesn't remove the curse from the item itself. Obviously a really useful spell when you need it, but you don't always know when you're going to need it. In general, we have other classes that can access Remove Curse, and Paladins and Clerics are automatically going to have it as a spell known, which means they can just take 24 hours and then put it on their spell list. So if you have a Paladin in the party who's a high enough level to cast this, or you have a Cleric in the party, then maybe I wouldn't take this spell because they can access that spell for you. My least favorite Abjuration spell at this level is Magic Circle. So Magic Circle, number 1, it's a minute casting, which means you're not using it in combat. And it is a stationary effect, which means you can't take it with you. So unless you know where a combat's going to occur and you're preparing for it beforehand, it's going to have no value for you. If you do know where the battle is going to occur, and you're preparing beforehand, then you are still paying a costly material component, and it's only useful against certain kinds of creatures. Really the only reason to take this spell that I can see is if you're doing something like a planar binding and then it needs this spell to work properly. Otherwise, I just wouldn't bother taking this spell. So let's move into our Conjuration spells. My favorite Conjuration spell at 3rd level is Thunderstep. So Thunderstep is a lot like Dimension Door because we can take an ally with us when we use it. Now, as I've mentioned before, I mentioned in the races video, if you are a small-sized caster, you can only take other small-sized or smaller allies. So if you're, say, a gnome wizard and you're trying to move a human, you can't do it. Now, someone mentioned to me that you could cast Enlarge Reduce on that human and then you could do it, but that's a lot of setup. That tends not to be a viable option in the cases where we want to move an ally. We generally want to move an ally if they are in trouble, and then we get them out of trouble. And I've talked about that in my tactics videos. But Thunderstep allows us early access because when we originally had the player's handbook, the first spell that did that was Dimension Door, which is a 4th level spell. Now we have a 3rd level option. Now Thunderstep does not give you the range of Dimension Door, and you need to see where you're going. So there are limitations there, but still it gives you that early access to that style of play where you're protecting your allies or just teleporting yourself. Now, Thunderstep has an additional effect where the area that you left, there's an explosion and there's some damage. That can be a good thing, that can be a bad thing. Friendly fire is a possibility. So that one's kind of a wash for me. But the big thing is, it's a little bit like Dimension Door, but we get it sooner. Now, would I prepare Thunderstep and Dimension Door? Never. I'm going to prepare one or the other because they are very redundant if we're going to take them both. My next favorite Conjuration spell at 3rd level is Sleet Storm, and I talked about Sleet Storm quite a bit in my mid-level tactics video, and so I won't go over all those things again, but I will just point out that Sleet Storm covers a massive area, and so then it is useful in cases where we have a big battlefield. Now, it does have friendly fire, but it doesn't do damage. What the main purpose of a Sleet Storm is you cast it on your enemies. They can't see you. A lot of them are going to fall down. They're moving through difficult terrain, so they're going to come out in waves instead of all at once. So it's the classic divide and conquer thing that we talked about in our last video with Web. But Sleet Storm is a better spell than Web. It is so much bigger. So huge area, divide your enemies, can be used as a fog cloud. Overall, very good spell, is going to use your concentration. Is Sleet Storm really effective at higher levels? No, I don't think it scales all that well because there are better spells that come along. There's even better spells here at 3rd level, but I do think it is a good choice for 3rd level spell, and I would probably continue preparing it until I had some kind of similar effect that could replace it. My next favorite Conjuration spell at this level is Stinking Cloud. Now, Stinking Cloud is actually going to fill a similar role to Sleet Storm in that we're using it to divide and conquer our enemies. Make a Constitution saving throw against poison. So those are two bad things right there. Constitution saving throw isn't the save we want to target, and poison is not the kind of effect we want to use because a lot of things are immune to poison. But when we don't have creatures that are immune to poison, the idea is if they fail the Constitution saving throw, they can't do anything. So they're stuck in the effect. Some of the creatures come out, and you get the divide and conquer thing. I just find that Stinking Cloud is going to be less reliable because of those two factors that I mentioned. My next favorite Conjuration spell at this level is Tidal Wave. So Tidal Wave creates an effect that covers an area that's 30 feet wide and 10 feet thick. So it's not a huge area, actually, for the level. But creatures in that area, they take 48 damage and are knocked prone if they fail a saving throw. And if they make their saving throw, they take half damage and they're not knocked prone. Now, the saving throw is dexterity, which is fine. And the big thing I have with this spell is that knocking prone is not a big deal. It can be useful. We can maybe attack with advantage. Maybe that's going to affect their movement that they were planning to take the next round if they were going to move at all. So there are chances that being knocked prone could help us, but it's not a guarantee. I mean, if those creatures don't have to move a lot the next turn, and then they go after you, then they just get up, right? So knocking prone isn't a big deal, The damage of 48 isn't a big amount of damage. Combining them together makes this an okay spell, but not a great spell. And my least favorite Conjuration spell at this level is Summon Lesser Demons. Because Summon Lesser Demons, it's the same level as the Conjure Animal spell, but it is so much worse in so many ways. Number one, with the Conjure Animal spell, you pick how many creatures are going to arrive and their challenge rating. Not with this spell. With this spell, you roll randomly. And then the DM picks the creature. So you really have no control over how many or what kinds of creature you're going to get, except that they're going to be demons. The other thing is the demons are hostile to you. Ideally, what you would do is you cast a spell, and then you would place the demons on the other side of an enemy, so on the back side, so they would have to fight through the enemy to get to you. And that would be okay, but again, generally with these summoning spells, I would hope to be able to use it for more than a single combat. But we can't here, because if the enemy is defeated, then the demons are going to turn on us. And then we're going to have to defeat them, which then makes this 1 hour duration kind of pointless. Now you can put a protective circle around yourself that prevents the demons from being able to attack you, but assuming you're not adventuring by yourself, there's going to be other PCs in your party, so you're kind of screwing the rest of your party over, because once the enemies are defeated, now they've got to defeat a new enemy that you conjured for them. Now let's talk about divination spells, and my favorite divination spell at this level is Clairvoyance. And Clairvoyance is our first kind of classical divination spell. It's the spell that you cast and then you can see somewhere else. Now that ability uses a 3rd level slot. It has a costly component, and it is not something that you would be doing in combat, so this is going to be a circumstantial spell. We can't move the effect, so we can't use it to explore a dungeon like we could maybe with an Arcane Eye, so it is going to be circumstantial. But in the right circumstances, it is our first classic divination spell that's going to allow us to see what's in that room that we can't get into, or that kind of thing, determine if there's traps sometimes, but using a 3rd level spell slot to get that information is often not worth it. Sometimes it is, so I would say that this is a circumstantially useful spell. My next favorite divination spell at this level is Tongues. Now, ideally we probably already have Comprehend languages, so there's automatically going to be a bit of redundancy here, because we've already gained the ability to understand other languages, we've already gained the ability to read other languages. All we don't have is the ability to communicate the other direction. Tongues is the spell that allows us to do that, but it's not a ritual, and it is using a 3rd level spell slot. So that's a big investment for what we have covered most of already. But still, if you want to be able to communicate with somebody, Tongues is the best way to do it. So I gotta say it's circumstantially useful, but I find it largely redundant for a wizard. That brings us into our enchantment spells. My favorite enchantment spell at this level is Enemies Abound. And Enemies Abound is a similar spell to, say, Crown of Madness that we saw last level, but it is a better spell in a number of ways. The most important to me is they don't have to be a humanoid anymore. So now the circumstantiality of Crown of Madness is gone. The second thing is that it's going to use an intelligence saving throw. And intelligence tends to be a pretty good saving throw to target. We often fight creatures that we know have a low intelligence, and they're not going to have any special bonus usually to an intelligence save. So we hit them with an Enemies Abound, and it's probably going to work. Now the problems with this spell are that once a creature fails its saving throw, we don't pick who it attacks. It is going to attack randomly. Anything that it can attack with its regular attack. So it may be closest to a PC, so it's going to attack a PC. Or it randomly rolls you, so it's going to attack you. So there's unpredictability here that I don't particularly like. And it is single target, and if they save, nothing happens. And it is using your concentration, and the duration's not all that long, it's 1 minute. So there are problems with this spell, but overall, I think it's an okay spell. Being able to target intelligence is a good thing, and it does make it when you are doing single target spells where if they save nothing happens, then intelligence is the save you want to target. So overall, okay spell. My least favorite enchantment spell at this level is Catnap. What Catnap does is you take 10 minutes to get a short rest, and you use a 3rd level spell slot to do so. And it doesn't mean that 10 minutes is safe. It's not like a rope trick where you cast a rope trick and then you can have a safe short rest. No, those 10 minutes better be safe. So here's the problem with this. Number one, you're using a 3rd level spell slot. That's a big investment. But mainly, if you have 10 minutes that's safe, you often have the hour that's safe. It's seldom a case where a DM is going to go, you can rest for 10 minutes but not for an hour. It's usually you either can't rest at all or you can rest the hour. Now, maybe there's times when you only have 10 minutes and you don't have an hour, times of the essence, but usually if times of the essence, you don't have that 10 minutes either. It's one of those things where it's just not a big enough difference. If you can stay 10 minutes safe somewhere, and that's not going to be a problem for adventure goals, then usually the hour is good enough. And then you can save yourself a 3rd level slot. Your best rest spells for Wizard, they're Rope Trick at 2nd level and Leomund's Tiny Hut at 3rd level. This just isn't in their league. And speaking of which, let's move to Evocation. And our number one selection for Evocation, of course, is Leomund's Tiny Hut. Leomund's Tiny Hut is a 1-minute cast, but it can be cast as a ritual, and I would imagine you would normally cast it as a ritual. So you're going to use 10 minutes, create a Leomund's Tiny Hut, and it is impenetrable. You just go in it with your party, and then the party can come and go as they please. And it's opaque, so nobody can see in, but you can see out, and they can't get in. By the way, if the enemies are hanging around the outside of the dome, waiting for it to come down, shoot them with some arrows, because you can shoot arrows at them. They can't shoot back at you. So it is just kind of broken how good this is as a way to ensure a long rest, though you can use it for short rest too. You want your safe short rest, and you can only get 10 minutes of safety because of that weird circumstance that I talked about with Catnap. Do a Leomund's Tiny Hut, and then you can just rest in the Leomund's Tiny Hut as long as you want. You can take a short rest, you can take a long rest. Easily one of the best wizard spells in the game. And because it's a ritual, you're not even using resources for it. Really a spell that I think is a must-have for a wizard. So let's move from what I think is potentially one of the most effective spells in the game to one of the spells that is the most iconic in the game, Fireball. And I like Fireball. Fireball is a good spell. I just think it's overrated because people go crazy over it, and I don't think it's worth going crazy over. It's not a must-have for wizards. I think it's a good spell to have. 8d6 damage at this level is decent damage, and the range is good, and the area of effect is good, and it's not using up your concentration, so there's all kinds of good stuff here. Put it all together and you have a solid blast spell, one of the best blast spells in the game. But let's not overestimate the damage. The average damage on this spell is 28, but they get half if they save, so between 14 and 28. And just think about how much damage some characters can do at this level. Is that damage really all that special then? It is if you can hit enough creatures with it, and that's the secret of Fireball. You want to use Fireball on large numbers of creatures. If you use it on a single target, it's not very effective at all, and it's a waste of your 3rd level slot. But against large numbers of creatures, Fireball does a lot of damage because you're doing that between 14 to 28 damage to so many different creatures. Another thing I like about Fireball is it's something you can do while you're concentrating on something else. So overall, a good spell. I don't always take it with my wizards. I don't think it's needed to be taken with your wizard, and I think the damage can be overestimated. But I do think it's an effective and good spell. So let's move on. My next favorite evocation spell at this level is Sending. And Sending, it's kind of odd that it's an evocation spell. You would think it would maybe be a divination spell. But basically, Sending is the standard for long-range communication in the game, and it's probably your best method of long-range communication in the game until you get into high-level spells or powerful magic items. Now, is this something I'm going to be doing in combat? Of course not. It is totally an out-of-combat kind of thing, and often when an off-time kind of thing. But in terms of campaigns, there are times when you will want to communicate with somebody who's halfway around the world, and Sending is the most efficient way to do it. So it is an okay spell. It's not something I'm going to jump on right away, but it's certainly something that is useful to have in most campaigns. And I would not prepare it, but I would use it instead on off time, and we would assume we prepare it in that off time to use. My next favorite evocation spell at this level is Melf's Minute Meteors. And I have a lot of problems with this spell, but there are certain circumstances where it's a decent spell. Basically, uses your concentration, and you get 6 mini fireballs. They kind of circle over your head, and then each round you can use your bonus action to fire off 2 of those mini fireballs. Each one does 2d6 damage, so that's potentially 4d6 damage per round. Area is not great, but over 3 rounds that would add up to 12d6 damage. The main reason why I think this isn't a bad spell is if you are a blaster wizard, so you are playing an evoker and you're focusing on blast spells, then you can combine this with the ability to cast a fireball. So you set up your Melf's Meteors, and then on your turn, you fire a fireball, and then you throw a couple Melf's Meteors in there as well, and suddenly you're increasing your 8d6 damage to 10d6 to 12d6 each round for 3 rounds. But, number 1, this uses an action to cast, so you have to prepare it beforehand, and the duration isn't all that long, so you better know you're going to go into combat. Number 2, it uses your concentration. This is the big one. It uses your concentration. That concentration can be broken, and then you can lose this effect. And number 3, remember, although we think 12d6 damage, remember, it's really 4d6 damage a round. That's what this is doing. 4d6 damage a round for 3 rounds to a small area of effect. So none of those things are great, but because it can be combined with something like Fireball, I think it's okay if you are a blaster wizard. If you're not a blaster wizard, I wouldn't recommend it. My next favorite evocation spell at this level is Lightning Bolt. And Lightning Bolt, I think, is just straight worse than Fireball. Now, the damage is the same, and it does lightning damage instead of doing fire damage, which might be okay, but you have to originate the spell from yourself. So it essentially has no range beyond the actual area of effect. And the area of effect isn't good. It is skinny, so unless you are firing down a hallway or your enemies are all lined up for you, you're just going to get less creatures in general than you would with a fireball. So it's going to do less damage. So less damage, no range. So it's just straight worse. If you want to take a spell to do damage at this level, take Fireball. Don't take Lightning Bolt. My next favorite evocation spell at this level is Wall of Water, and I don't really like Wall of Water. It's going to give disadvantage on attacks against you that are ranged. It's going to have the damage from fire spells that come through, but this is a defensive spell that is requiring your concentration and is doing things like disadvantage, which we could have achieved at lower levels. And really the only thing I think this spell has going for it is there is this effect where if it's hit with cold damage, it might freeze, and then you might get kind of a wall of ice effect. But those areas are small. I think that's kind of hard to set up. But with some teamwork, it could potentially be done, and you could potentially actually get a solid wall with a level 3 spell. So I'm not going to give it a red rating, but I got to tell you that in general, I'd probably avoid this spell unless we've made plans to make use of that ability of it. My least favorite evocation spell, though, is Wall of Sand. Wall of Sand blocks sight, which we could do with a first level spell. We can even do it with a cantrip. And then it slows the movement through the wall effect. But of course, the wall is only 10 feet thick, so this isn't a huge obstacle to overcome. But creatures can move right through it. There's no damage. It's really mainly about blocking line of sight and slowing things down. And we have methods to do that using lower level spells. So the only reason I could ever see taking this is because you want that 10 feet of slowing effect plus the blocked vision effect, and those two together is something special for you, and you want to get it up in an action. But in general, just stay away from this. I don't think it does nearly enough for the level of spell it is. So let's get into our illusion spells, and one of my favorite 3rd level spells in the game, and one of my favorite spells in the game is here too, and that is Hypnotic Pattern. Hypnotic Pattern is an area of effect spell. It gives the enemies 1 saving throw versus wisdom, and if they fail that saving throw, and then they are incapacitated for the duration of the spell, unless they take damage or an ally uses an action to shake them awake. And that means that this is one of the very few spells that's mass effect that doesn't provide a second saving throw. And that's why this is kind of special, and it completely takes enemies out of the fight. There's a lot of spells that are single target spells that if they save, nothing happens, and if they don't save, they're screwed. That this kind of is as good as, but it affects multiple creatures. Now, I've had some people mention that when they play, the creatures that made their save go and immediately shake everyone else awake. And maybe that's the way your DM plays. I don't think that's the common thing. I mean, certainly some kind of creatures know what a hypnotic pattern is. They know how to defeat it. They know that their allies can be shaken to end the effect. But I think a lot of creatures won't know that, especially creatures that aren't intelligent. It would be really odd for me if a DM is playing and they have, the tiger go and shake its ally awake. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. DM can do what they want to do. But I think in most tables, you're going to find that the shaking of allies awake can happen, but it's not something that happens a lot, and it's not something that prevents this spell from being an extremely effective spell. My next favorite illusion spell at this level is Fear, and Fear is actually going to fill a similar role to what Hypnotic Pattern does, that you create a 30-foot cone, so hopefully we're hitting lots of enemies, and they're going to make a saving throw, and if they don't make that saving throw, they have to run away. And again, they don't get another saving throw unless they get to a point where they don't see you anymore. So they have to run, in some cases, a long way away. So what we're doing is we're dividing our enemies. Half our enemies run away, the other half we can deal with. The reasons why I don't like Fear as much as, say, Hypnotic Pattern is, number one, when creatures run away, they're a little harder to deal with than if they're staying in one spot. But the main difference for me is about placement of the spell, because cone spells must originate from you, so that really limits where you can place this spell. It is harder to place. You can't place it at range. It can only be placed near you, and that cone shape can be hard to fit. Remember, we don't want to be hitting our allies with this either, so getting that Fear in the right position to get lots of enemies isn't as easy as something like a Hypnotic Pattern. So don't like it as much, but I still think it's a very good spell for the reasons I stated. My next favorite illusion spell at this level is Major Image. And Major Image is kind of your classic illusion spell. You can create a creature or an object, and it affects vision, it can make noise, it can have smells, it can generate warmth, all kinds of things. So it really can appear real, and it can occupy a bigger space. And illusions are hard to give you a lot of examples because every example is super, super circumstantial, except maybe the making of a wall to block vision, but we have other methods of doing that. Remember that illusionists can use malleable illusions to change the nature of this illusion, so you could have an illusion of one thing and then you might change it to an illusion of another thing. Now the one thing about this spell that's kind of interesting is that if you cast it with a 6th level slot, it's permanent. So if you are an illusionist and then you cast this spell using a 6th level slot, you have a permanent illusion that you can change at need. Now, can you move the illusion? Well, technically speaking, no. I mean, it is cast in the area that is in the spell description of the spell, and we can't change that with malleable illusions. So if we are, say, in the city and we cast a spell on Seafarer Street, then that illusion's going to need to stay in Seafarer Street, even with malleable illusions. The question is, can you cast the spell on something that moves, like on the back of a wagon? And that will depend on your DM. And if you can, then if you're an illusionist, you can make a lot of use of malleable illusions. It really comes quite impressive. But for most characters, this is just an illusion spell. You need to be creative with it. Has combat uses, has out of combat uses. It's the best kind of straight illusion spell in the game, and certainly better than Silent Image before that and Minor Image before that. But it is using your concentration, so keep that in mind. And my least favorite illusion spell, but still a decent illusion spell, is Phantom Steed. And Phantom Steed is a ritual spell, which means we can cast it without using a spell slot or preparing it. And what it does is it gives us a steed, which is a horse, and it has a movement speed of 100. Otherwise, it's basically a horse. So you can use Phantom Steed, and then you can mount it, and then you have increased movement. And that's basically what it does. You get a little bit of extra movement. And that can be useful. I mean, even in combat, you can be on a mount and then you have movement. Now, that Phantom Steed can die pretty easy. So you may find that in a combat, you might have it for the first round or two, and then you lose it, and then you have to walk around again. Not a big deal. Overall, in terms of traveling, this is hard to use because the rituals take so long. So then creating mounts for your entire party will depend on your DM's opinion on whether you can cast that ritual while you're riding on a beast at 100 feet of movement around. And some DMs aren't going to play with that. So in terms of a travel spell, it's okay. It's mainly about just some increased maneuverability, and for that, it is okay. So this brings us to our necromancy spells. My favorite necromancy spell at 3rd level is Animate Dead, and you know what Animate Dead does. You cast it, you get a skeleton or you get a zombie. It lasts for 24 hours, at which point the magic leaves it. Now, having a skeleton or zombie is a useful thing, but it is important to note it requires your bonus action on your turn to command the skeleton or zombie. So that is a bit of a limitation that you just need to keep in mind. Still, having an extra companion along that can open doors for you, detect traps for you, often by setting them off, maybe be another target in combat, fire arrows, all those kinds of things. Animate Dead, a useful spell to have. Now, necromancers are especially good with Animate Dead, and if you are a necromancer, this is a must-have. This would be a blue rating spell for you. If you're playing a necromancer, this is the reason you played a necromancer, is because you can enhance the creatures that you get with Animate Dead, and you get more of them. So there's no reason not to take this spell if you're a necromancer, and you might even want to carry a backpack full of bones so you can have skeletons at need, because you are going to be using this spell regularly. For everybody else who's not a necromancer, it's an okay spell. I think it is useful enough of the time to make it worthwhile. Having a creature just helps with the action economy. And I made a Paladin spell video before where I talked about Crusader's Mantle and having additional creatures that you could use if you are a necromancer, and you can get a bunch of skeletons and you can get bows for all those skeletons, and then a Paladin hits him with a Crusader's Mantle. That would be pretty effective. Just bringing that up. So let's go way down to my next favorite necromancy spell at this level, which is Life Transference. And what Life Transference does is you cause yourself 48 necrotic damage, and then an ally can get double that amount healed. So it is a healing option for wizards, and that's reasonably rare, but a healing option where you have to do damage to yourself, which means it's not a good healing spell. Are there cases where you would want it? Sure. If you are in a party and there's very few healing options in the party, it at least gives you a healing option. But I do not like spells that do damage to yourself. It means you can't really even use it if you're concentrating on another spell, because it's going to trigger a concentration save. So it has big limitations there. I would much rather it just deliver 48 healing than 8d8 healing and then you take 48 damage. That isn't such a good trade for me. The rest of the necromancy spells aren't very good because for some reason the designers don't like necromancy. I've mentioned that before, and we're going to see the examples here. The first one I'll talk about is Bestow Curse. I guess it's my favorite of my least favorites. Bestow Curse has a range of touch, provides a saving throw, and if they fail that saving throw, the effects aren't nearly as effective as we get with area of effect spells that can affect multiple enemies. So I'm not sure what they were thinking about that, and delivering it by touch. Oh, and it's going to require your concentration to maintain. I just don't see any values here. Now, if we cast it with a higher level slot, we can do it without concentration. In that case, this is an okay spell. It still has the problems that the effects are not dramatic, and you have to deliver by touch, and it's providing a saving throw. So there's still lots of limitations, but being able to do it without concentration does add some value to this spell, and I might rate it orange if we cast it with a 5th level slot. But even then, I don't think it's great because the effect just isn't all that dramatic for me. And if we're investing a 5th level slot, we would expect a big payoff. My second least favorite necromancy spell at this level is Feign Death. So cast Feign Death and you can pretend you're dead for an hour, or an ally can pretend they're dead for an hour. That's it. That's what it does. Now, you can cast this as a ritual, but then you need 10 minutes. How often does that come up? Almost never. I can't even think of a single example in 40 years of role-playing where I've had that situation come up. Maybe it has. There's been a lot I've forgotten. So I just don't even see spending the 150 gold pieces to copy this into my spellbook, even if I found it. Because if it's never ever going to come up, then why do I want to spend the 150 gold pieces? Strangely enough, not the worst spell at this level. So my least favorite necromancy spell for this level, and really one of the worst necromancy spells there is Vampiric Touch. Vampiric Touch is an awful spell. What you do is you cast it, it's going to use your concentration. Then you need to go up to an enemy and touch them. And you know what you do? 3d6 necrotic damage. So like 10 or 11 points of damage on average. That's how much damage this does. The damage you would expect from a first level spell, except to an area. I mean, Burning Hands does this damage, and you can hit multiple enemies with it. But we're going to use a third level spell slot to do that damage. And then you regain half that amount of hit points yourself. So if you're not wounded, that doesn't do anything. But if you are wounded, then you can heal a tiny amount by putting yourself in the massive danger of going into touch range with the enemies. As a combat spell, just a terrible spell. Now, it's using your concentration, and this is almost kind of a trap. You can do it round after round while you concentrate on this ability. So it's going to give you a terrible, terrible thing to do with your action every round for a minute. Now, I guess, out of combat, maybe if you take prisoners and you are a sadist, then you could use Vampiric Touch to kill your enemies and heal yourself. Still not the most effective out-of-combat healing in the game. So again, even then, I don't see this being an overly effective spell. It's just garbage as a combat spell, and I would recommend you just stay far, far away from it. So this brings us into our transmutation spells, and my favorite transmutation spell at 3rd level is Slow. And Slow in general is not going to have the same effect as a Hypnotic Pattern or a Fear spell if we hit the same number of creatures with it. The advantage of Slow is that we can cast it in a chaotic melee, and I talked about that in my mid-level tactics video. But when we have that chaotic melee, Slow is one of the best choices because we can just choose our enemies, there's no friendly fire, and we can affect multiple enemies with this. They make a wisdom saving throw. If they fail, there's all kinds of bad effects for them. They lose any multiple attacks they had in the round. They can only take an action or a bonus action on their turn. They're losing their reactions when it's not their turn. So this has all kinds of bad effects on a creature. It really debuffs them heavily. Now they still technically can fight, so they can still technically attack, they can still technically cast spells, it's just all reduced. So it is a good way to take up to 6 enemies and then just make them worse. And it gives your party that mechanical advantage over them in the combat. Now they get a saving throw every round, so this is something that once we get to the point where we're only affecting 1 or 2 creatures, I'm probably not going to maintain my concentration on this spell anymore. I'm going to drop it. And at higher levels, I'm not sure this is a spell that's worth a preparation slot. This is a really good mid-level spell. My second favorite transmutation spell at this level is Water Breathing. And that might be a surprise to some people, especially considering that in my guide I didn't rate it nearly that high. But as I've played, I've just found that being able to use the ritual at the beginning of the day to make every single PC in the party, as well as any other allies nearby, able to breathe water for the entire day without concentration, without any other resources, we don't even have to prepare it, is just useful. I mean, I don't always need to go underwater, but you just cast this at the beginning of the day and then you don't have to worry about it, right? We don't have to prepare. We don't have to know if water's coming up. It's just there every day for free. And giving everybody in your party the ability to breathe water all the time is just a pretty good thing to be able to do at no resource cost. My next favorite transmutation spell at this level is Blink, and Blink is one of those spells that we can layer on ourselves when we are layering our defenses. It uses an action to cast, so again, it's something you want to cast if you know that you're going into combat. But if you do know you're going into combat, Blink doesn't use your concentration. So we can layer it up with our mirror images, and then we can go into combat, and we're harder than ever to hit. What Blink does is if it's not your turn, basically 50-50% chance that you enter the ethereal plane till the beginning of your next turn. Then when you reappear, you can teleport up to 10 feet or appear in a space unoccupied within 10 feet of where you originated, and then you reappear on your turn. Keep in mind though that Blink could interfere with some things. Like, for example, enemy spellcasters no longer have to worry about you counterspelling them if you are under a Blink effect. So there are some downsides to think about, but in terms of your own defense, it absolutely does beef them up without using concentration. It does use a 3rd level spell slot though, which is a fairly hefty cost. So I don't love this spell, but I think it's okay as a spell to layer defenses with. My next favorite transmutation spell at this level is Fly, and you know what fly does. The speed is 60 feet around, which is pretty good for fly. A lot of fly abilities allow you to move your regular movement speed or 30-foot movement speed, so being able to move at 60 is good. Using your concentration is not. The fact that it uses your concentration heavily limits this spell. What it's really going to be used for as transportation to an area that you normally couldn't get to, or because you're in a combat and you have a melee character that can deliver lots of damage that needs to be able to fly to hit an enemy. Then you use it as a buff. And those are really the two main uses of the fly spell. But in terms of what it does, you know what it does. But it's single target, but you can upcast it to affect multiple creatures, and that is fairly useful to do when you're higher level. So fly is a spell I might keep as I move up in levels because I can affect multiple creatures then. My next favorite transmutation spell at this level is Haste. Haste, I think, is an okay buff. It's single target, it uses your concentration. Usually it's about giving them one additional attack around. Now, for the right character, that might be a lot of damage. And for other characters, it might not be so much. So Haste overall, it's an okay buff. I don't think it's a great buff, but we only have a limited number of decent buff options. And the reason why I want to have some buff spells is because sometimes creatures are resistant to magic, or maybe they're resistant to the type of damage I do, and I don't have a lot of useful things I can do. But a buff always works, right? You cast a buff on your ally, now they're better, and so you are contributing. My next favorite spell for transmutation at this level is Tiny Servant, and Tiny Servant is actually going to do a similar thing for you than Animate Dead would, except this time you're creating a Tiny Servant, which is basically like a construct. It's not nearly as effective as a skeleton or a zombie, but it does have a number of condition immunities, and we can throw things on it like a Dragon's Breath, and then it can deliver that kind of thing in combat. But keep in mind, this one also, just like Animate Dead, uses your bonus action to be able to command it on your round. So we can't combine it with an Animate Dead. It's one or the other. And in general, I think the Animate Dead is a little bit better, and it has a better duration. This one only lasts for 8 hours. But as an alternative to Animate Dead, because maybe you think Animate Dead is a little too evil for your character, then Tiny Servant is an okay substitute. My next favorite transmutation spell at this level is Gaseous Form. And Gaseous Form, of course, does what you think it does. It turns you into a cloud of gas, and then you can move through cracks and you can fly. But it also doesn't do some things you would think it would do. Non-magical weapons can still hurt you. You have resistance to them, but somebody stabs you with a sword, you still take damage. Magical weapons do full damage to you. You also can still be affected by magic. You get advantage on a couple different kinds of saving throws, but lots of magic spells will still work on you. So you're not getting any kind of immunity here. And the movement is really slow, 10 feet around. So as an escape spell, this doesn't really work. It's more about maneuverability through those cracks and things like that, which we might be able to do with teleport spells later on, but maybe at 5th level we don't have access to that kind of spell. Spells like Thunderstep, we have to be able to see where we're going, so Gaseous Form might allow us a little bit of maneuverability that we didn't otherwise have. And that's really about it. So it's super circumstantial. And so generally, I wouldn't recommend it for most characters. The next transmutation spell I want to talk about is Flame Arrows. So you cast Flame Arrows on a quiver full of arrows. Then every time that an arrow is drawn, it becomes a Flame Arrow, and it does an additional 1d6 fire damage if it hits. And then once 12 pieces of ammunition are drawn, it ceases to work. So basically, this is like giving somebody a Hunter's Mark or giving somebody a Hex, except the duration sucks. This is also going to use your concentration, so it's not like we're getting around any kind of mechanic there either. Now, wizards don't have Hex or Hunter's Mark, and those spells can't be given to somebody else. So there are some advantages here. We can use this as a buff on another character. Also, they don't have to worry about using their bonus actions to switch targets or anything like that. So there's a little bit of flexibility here that those spells don't have. But 12 pieces of ammunition, you could go through that really fast, right? Think about this. Let's say you have a fighter and they're 5th level, so they're firing twice around, but maybe they also have crossbow experts, so now they're firing 3 times around, and then they use their action surge, so now they're attacking 5 times in a round. They've gone through half that ammunition in one round. So the duration here is a problem for me. And the 1d6 damage per arrow isn't enough damage unless they're firing a lot, right? If they're only firing once or twice a round, then we're only adding 1 or 2d6 damage a round, and we're using our concentration. We could be concentrating on a flaming sphere and be doing more damage than that with a lower level spell. So then why would we cast this spell and concentrate on it? Only because we have an ally that can deliver lots of arrows in a single round. In that case, it'll deliver a decent amount of damage, but the duration is not good at all. My least favorite transmutation spell at 3rd level is Erupting Earth. And what Erupting Earth is it's a crappy blast spell. 20-foot cube, so it's a tiny area of effect, does 3d12 damage. So although it's a better blast spell than something like a Vampiric Touch, it's still bad damage for this level. If we can consider Fireball, Fireball does a much bigger area and much more damage. So why am I casting this? Well, I get a small area of difficult terrain. That's what I get. And difficult terrain is not a big deal. So expect this spell to deliver about 20 points of damage for creatures that fail their save, about half that for creatures that make their save in a 20-foot cube. Just doesn't stack up to the other area of effect spells we've seen at this level. Now there is a trap portion of this spell for you to be aware of, and a lot of people talk about this a lot, is that you can upcast this spell and it adds a d12 of damage every level, except instead of, say, the d6 of damage you would get from Fireball. And they'll point out that fairly quickly, if we're upcasting Fireball and Erupting Earth will bypass Fireball for damage. Now, I don't know if it really bypasses Fireball for damage. It bypasses Fireball for a single target damage, but if we're hitting 3 times as many creatures with a Fireball as an Erupting Earth will never catch Fireball for damage. But secondly, upcast Fireballs are awful. Don't upcast your Fireballs. Fireball is a spell that we're going to be using at 5th level and 6th level and maybe at 7th level as a 3rd level slot. Don't use your 4th level slots. Don't use your 5th level slots on Fireball. Fireball doesn't scale well. Most blast spells don't scale well, and the reason is because you're adding 1 die of damage for upcasting. Now, if that 1 die is a d12, yeah, that's better than adding a d6, but it's not enough. If we're going to scale blast spells effectively, they need to be doing round by round damage. So if I upcast, say, a flaming sphere, it adds 1d6 damage, but if I use that flaming sphere 10 times, then it's adding 10d6 damage for 1 level of scaling, and that's a lot better than adding 1d12. So don't upcast your Fireballs, don't upcast your Erupting Earths. In fact, don't even put Erupting Earth in your spellbook, and I think you'll be better off for it. And that is all the 3rd level spells. So next week we'll be talking about the 4th level spells, and then we're going to get into Polymorph. Won't that be cool? But for today, I'm going to sit back and I'm going to relax, and I'm going to have some fun, because D&D is for everyone. Thanks, Optimancers. I'll see you next time.